Hi, it's Thursday, July 16th, the year 2026. My name is Eugene. I was a draftee in the United States Army between July 1967 and July 1969. I have some things I'd like to talk about, and I'm going to call this video Other Priorities. In 1989, Dick Cheney was asked why he never served in Vietnam. He said, and I'm paraphrasing his words here, that he had other priorities in the 1960s, other priorities than military services. 5 deferments got him there. I didn't have that option. This is what my other priorities looked like. Let's start with the men who never had to answer that question at all. Cheney got 5 deferments starting in 1963. He married his wife just weeks after the Gulf of Tonkin resolution raised fears the draft was about to expand. When married men without children lost their exemption, he got reclassified again, this time for hardship because his wife was pregnant. Years later, in front of the press, he called it other priorities. In front of the Senate committee confirming him as Secretary of Defense, he told the softer story that he'd have been very happy to serve if he'd been drafted. Dan Quayle got into the Indiana National Guard in 1969 at a time when guard slots were exactly how connected families kept their sons out of Vietnam. Waiting lists were long for everybody else. He later admitted, in his own words, that joining increased his chances of avoiding combat. George W. Bush did the same thing through the Texas Air National Guard. Same pattern, same kind of family connections behind it. Here's the numbers that matter. Of the more than 58,000 Americans killed in Vietnam, fewer than 100 were National Guardsmen. That's not an accident. That's a system working exactly as the people who could afford it wanted it to work. So who filled the spaces that they left open? In 1966, Robert McNamara, who was Lyndon Johnson's Secretary of Defense, launched something called Project 100,000. It lowered the draft standards so men who'd previously failed the qualifying test could now be drafted. McNamara sold it publicly as a program to lift men out of poverty. In practice, it was a way to keep pulling bodies into the war without touching the deferments of college kids from connected families. Roughly 350,000 men came through that program. The exact casualty numbers are disputed. Some sources say triple the death rate of other troops. Others say the raw math is closer than that. I'm not going to pretend I know the precise multiplier. What I know is this. These were the men who filled the space that Cheney's deferments and Quayle's guard slot and Bush's guard slot left wide open. I trained next to some of them in basic training. No letter from a psychiatrist, no family connections, no National Guard slot waiting. They went. Some of them didn't come back. Now, you've all seen the movie Forrest Gump. Bubba, the friend of Forrest who just wants to go home and run a shrimp boat, who dies in Vietnam without ever really understanding what he was doing there. That character wasn't an accident of screenwriting. Forrest and Bubba are the popular image of McNamara's Project 100,000, whether the movie ever says that name or not, and the real ones were not fiction. Now let me tell you my own story. I was classified 1Y for about a year, based on a letter from a psychiatrist says that I was ambivalent about my sexuality. No Army psychiatrist ever spoke to me or evaluated me. The draft board called me in anyway and reclassified me 1A. At the induction center, I refused to take the loyalty oath at the Fort Hamilton Induction Center along with some members of Progressive Labor Party. We disrupted the whole induction. Military police threw me down a flight of stairs. I half expected to be sent home after that. I wasn't. So I raised my right hand and stepped over the line anyway. That's how what I'd call my unusual military career began. Basic training was at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, Company E62. I need to tell you about my drill sergeant, a man named Norman Greenwald. Greenwald was a bitter man, often drunk, surly around his men. Reportedly, he grew up in a Chicago orphanage. He'd held the rank of sergeant first class, right on the edge of making master sergeant, until he got arrested during a brawl at the non-commissioned officers club bar. That cost him 2 stripes, and that was a financial hit that would follow him the rest of his life. Around the same time, at that base, an Army was court-martialed for refusing to train Green Berets. He'd called them murderers of women and children. He was convicted and sent to prison, and the colonel who was presiding over that trial ruled that whether Levy's statements were even true or not wasn't relevant to the case. Now, previously, during the demonstrations, I've been one of those people who shouted on the streets of New York, "One side's right, one side's wrong. We're on the side of the Viet Cong." It's reasonable to think word of that got back to Greenwald. During a live poison gas drill, my gas mask had been filled with water. On an obstacle course run with bayonets fixed, I was following Greenwald's own instructions, and I ended up with my rifle and bayonet turned around, about to run myself through. Until the first sergeant, a black NCO overseeing the whole exercise, caught up with us and stopped me from turning myself into shish kebab just in time. So I don't say this lightly even now, decades later. I believe Greenwald wanted me dead, the same way he'd have wanted any Viet Cong dead. I can't prove it in a courtroom, but I was lucky to walk out of that training company alive, and that doesn't come from nowhere. Now it's October 1968. I was home on a pre-deployment leave, expected back at Fort Lewis for deployment to Vietnam. There was a three-way race for President of the United States that year, and George Wallace brought his campaign to Madison Square Garden. His running mate, a retired Air Force general, was on record talking about using nuclear weapons in Vietnam. I was watching television at my parents' apartment when the news showed a rally forming in the Garment District. A leftist Irish American politician, whose name I don't remember, was urging people to go and surround Madison Square Garden that night, and I went. When I got there, it was pandemonium. I found myself being chased by a mounted police officer swinging his baton. In the middle, with all that running, I built up a lot of adrenaline, and I jumped over a parked car. Coincidentally, I collided with an old neighborhood friend of mine, a black man named James Miles. We decided to get out of there quickly and together, but we were cut off by first one unmarked police car, then several marked police cars. They threw us in one of the cars and started throwing punches and banging our knees with an illegal blackjack. At the Midtown South precinct, they handcuffed the two of us together and threw us down a flight of stairs. We were charged with riot, felonious assault, and resisting arrest. A grand jury threw out the felonies. The misdemeanors stuck. Now, I want to correct something here because I was there and I know what I saw. Some accounts of that night claim that police rescued black protesters from an angry crowd. That is not what I witnessed, and it never would have happened. The cops were all pro Wallace. What I saw was protesters cornering some of Wallace's supporters, not the other way around. I'm telling you what I actually saw, not what got printed. My trial dragged on. It was set for a couple of weeks after I was supposed to report back to Fort Lewis. I went to the induction center on Whitehall Street with my duffel bag anyway. After some time, I was told to report to Fort Wadsworth instead when my leave ended. The trial ultimately outlasted my time in the Army, so it never got resolved before I was already a civilian again. Now, about the anti war movement itself, because it wasn't one big thing, and I want to be honest about that. The Socialist Workers' Party dominated the civilian anti war movement at the time. Their whole approach was disciplined, permitted, and marshaled. Peaceful legal was practically their slogan. We used to taunt them, their marshals, at demonstrations. I'd shout at them, "What's the matter? There aren't enough cops in Harlem?" Progressive labor was different, willing to actually disrupt things the way we disrupted my own induction. But I fell out with them, partly because they abandoned people the way they abandoned Andy Stapp when things got serious, and partly because of their posturing that they were more revolutionary than the Vietnamese. I landed with American Service Union, and I spent time editing the bond. It was their monthly that we mailed out to GIs. The union was tied to Andy Stapp, to Workers' World, and Youth Against War and Fascism. About this too. The ASU's claimed membership numbers, tens of thousands by some accounts, were almost certainly exaggerated, although there probably were chapters that never got in touch with the New York headquarters, so it's an unknown. And here's the thing that most people miss. Most GI resistance didn't run through any organization at all. It was personal, it was informal. Word of mouth between guys who'd never heard of the ASU or the SWP or Progressive Labor. That's the part that never makes it into anybody's book. I was at Fort Lewis in 1968. I got promoted to Specialist 4 in a completely normal timeline, even though I believe the military intelligence was watching my activities the whole time. Now, going back to the interview I was pulled into at the downtown office outside of Fort Jackson. It was conducted by a military intelligence officer in civilian clothes. We were in a room that felt neutral, and he tried to ply me with cigarettes and coffee to get as much information from me as he could, including information about people in New York. I think whatever information he developed about me and They sent people to every place that I had lived, worked, or gone to school, by the way, and asked people all kinds of questions about me under the pretense that I was being considered for a high security job. Um, I don't think that information got passed on to the non commissioned officers around me at Fort Lewis. Some of the NCOs there were generally friendly with me, so I don't think they knew. After Martin Luther King was assassinated, a sergeant pulled me aside and told me the base was about to lock down and that I should get out while I still could. I didn't. I stayed because I intended to publicly refuse any order to be sent into Seattle or Tacoma for riot control. In the end, the local and state police contained the riots on their own. We were never sent in. Around that same time, a batch of hand grenades went missing from the base. My own theory, and it's only a theory, is that the brass quietly secured them themselves and let a theft rumor cover the gap, because nobody ever actually threw a grenade during any of that unrest. The last piece. At Fort Wadsworth, there I was a clerk. There was another clerk in Vietnam who I never met, who was routing a couple of guys a day back to us for transport to Germany. I never learned why. Most of those guys arrived with Article 15 non judicial punishment in their record jackets, as well as their pay frozen and reduced. I undid what I could. There was no computers in those days, and I delayed their flights, got them their money, and assigned them to the transient barracks on Staten Island. I did whatever I could get away with at the time. As a member of the clerk mafia, I also burned a set of documents in order to bamboozle an inspector general inspection. I did this with the complicity of a first lieutenant who was nominally my commanding officer. He was a refrigeration specialist by training, and he was very cynical about the whole war, and he went along with what I was doing without asking any questions. I guess God works in mysterious ways. So when people tell you veterans shouldn't get any special treatment, I'd ask them which part they actually mean. The five deferments, the guard slot with a waiting list that someone had room for the connected, or for the misdemeanor record I earned getting thrown down a police station stairs, the frozen pay I personally reversed for guys with none of my options, the trial that outlasted my entire enlistment. I'm not asking for sympathy. I take my 10% civil service reference, which I used to get a job for New York City, and I'm claiming the veterans benefits now that I only recently found out because they do not do outreach. But I don't feel one bit of guilt about taking any of those benefits. I earned both the hard way, not by having other priorities, by not having any other choice.